June 21st, 1944, Minsk, Belarusia. Inside the headquarters of Army Group Center, Field Marshal Ernst Busch stared at the vast situation map that dominated the room. To the untrained eye, the map showed a stable front line, a defensive wall of German steel stretching hundreds of kilometers across the Soviet Union. To Busch, a loyalist who believed implicitly in the Führer's doctrine of fortified places, the map represented an unshakable reality. His armies were dug in, his supply lines were established. His reserves, though thin, were positioned exactly where German logic dictated the enemy must attack. Busch was a man of the old school, a commander who believed in the rigid geometry of warfare. He looked at the terrain south of his position, the open plains of Ukraine, and nodded. That was where the Soviet blow would fall. Every intelligence report from Berlin confirmed it. Every movement of enemy railcars, every intercepted radio transmission suggested that the Red Army was massing in the south to strike towards the Balkans or Poland. The center, where Busch stood, was protected not just by soldiers, but by geography. To his front lay dense forests and the impassable Pripet Marshes. No modern army could move heavy tanks through that swampy nightmare, or so he believed. What Busch did not see, what his map did not show, was that he was staring at a mirage. The stability he felt was a product of the greatest deception operation in military history, Maskirovka. While Busch adjusted the pins on his map, marking the locations of his fortified cities like Vitebsk and Bobruisk that were ordered to hold to the last man, an invisible army was gathering in the tree lines just a few kilometers away. For weeks, the Soviet front opposite Army Group Center had been eerily quiet. German listening posts reported a decrease in radio traffic. Aerial reconnaissance showed empty railyards and camouflaged positions that appeared abandoned. Busch interpreted this silence as weakness, or at least as confirmation that the Soviets were shifting their strength south. He was comfortable. He felt the confidence of a man who believes he understands the rules of the game. But the silence was a weapon. It was an orchestrated silence designed to deafen German intelligence. Under the cover of darkness, with radios strictly silenced and tank engines turned off, the Soviets were moving an ocean of steel into the forests. Over 1.7 million men, 4,000 tanks, and 24,000 artillery pieces were creeping into position. They moved only at night, hiding under vast nets during the day. They built underwater bridges across the swamps that German reconnaissance planes could not see. Busch's intelligence officer, Colonel von Peter, had raised minor concerns about shuffling in the enemy lines, but these were dismissed. The German High Command, obsessively focused on the threat to the south, had stripped Busch of his best units. They had taken his air support, his artillery reserves, and his operational freedom. Busch did not protest. He trusted the system. He trusted the map. He believed that the swamp was a wall. He did not know that on the other side of that wall, Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky had not only solved the riddle of the swamp, but had turned it into a highway for an armored avalanche. As the sun set on June 21st, the eve of the third anniversary of the German invasion of Russia, Field Marshal Busch went to dinner, believing his sector was the safest place on the Eastern Front. He was guarding the door that he thought was locked. He did not realize the enemy wasn't planning to knock. They were planning to tear the entire house down. The silence outside his headquarters was not the absence of war. It was the deep breath before the scream. The scream came long before dawn. It did not begin on the front lines, but deep in the German rear, in the dark forests that Field Marshal Busch had ignored. For months, Soviet partisans had been coordinating with the Red Army, waiting for a single signal. On the night of June 19th, that signal came. In a coordinated explosion of violence that defied German comprehension, over 40,000 rail lines were blown up simultaneously. The logistical arteries of Army Group Center were severed in a single stroke. Supply trains derailed in balls of fire. Communication wires were cut. The nervous system of the German defense was paralyzed before the first tank engine even started. But inside the headquarters, the full magnitude of this disaster was slow to dawn. Reports of bandit activity were common. Busch and his staff, still blinded by their own confidence, viewed these as isolated terror attacks, annoying but not fatal. They did not see the pattern. They did not understand that the ground beneath their feet had just been cut away. They went to sleep on June 21st, believing they could still maneuver, still react, still fight. They woke up to a world that was ending. At 5 hours on June 22nd, Exactly 3 years to the day after Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, the sky opened up. This was not a typical artillery barrage, it was a geological event. Thousands of Soviet guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers unleashed a torrent of steel that erased the German forward positions. The earth didn't just shake, it liquefied. Trenches that had been dug for months collapsed in seconds, burying entire companies alive. The Feste Plätze, those fortified cities that Hitler had ordered to stand like breakwaters against a tide, were instantly isolated, their defenders deafened, dazed, and cut off from any central command. Then came the air power. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled these skies, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, swarms of Ilyushin Il, 2 Sturmovix, the flying tanks, descended on the German artillery positions. They hunted down the few reserves trying to move forward. Busch's communication network, already damaged by partisans, was now completely obliterated. He sat in his headquarters, demanding status reports, but the phones were dead. The teleprinters were silent. The map on his table, once a source of comfort, had become a useless piece of paper. The red pins representing his divisions were being swept away, but he had no way to move them, no way to know which units still existed, and which were already ghosts. Confusion reigned. In the first critical hours, German commanders at the front tried to follow their rigid orders. Hold the line, do not retreat. But there was no line left to hold. The Soviet assault didn't hit the fortified cities head-on. It flowed around them like water. The Pripet Marshes, the terrain feature Busch had counted on as an impassable wall, suddenly came alive. The Soviet engineers had built corduroy roads, logs laid side by side over the mud, allowing tanks to drive where only infantry should have walked. The 65th Army broke through the swamp, emerging squarely on the German flank. The surprise was total. The trap had not just sprung, it had crushed the bone. By the evening of the first day, the illusion of control began to crack. Busch stared at the gaps opening on his map gaps that shouldn't have been there. He finally realized that the silence from the south was not because the enemy wasn't there, but because the enemy was here. The deceptive quiet of the past weeks had been replaced by a cacophony of destruction. The hammer hadn't fallen on Ukraine, it had fallen on him. And for the first time, the cold grip of panic began to tighten around the heart of Army Group Center. The fortress was not a shield, it was a cage, and the Soviets had just locked the door. The tragedy of Army Group Center was not just caused by Soviet tanks, but by a single German phrase, Feste Plätze, or fortified places. This was Hitler's master strategy, a rigid doctrine which dictated that key cities must be held at all costs to act as breakwaters, slowing down the enemy tide. In theory, these fortress cities would tie up Soviet forces, allowing the German reserves to counterattack. But in the reality of June 1944, this doctrine became a death sentence for 300,000 men. General Busch, bound by his loyalty and his orders, watched as his armies were pinned to the map like butterflies in a display case, unable to move, unable to retreat, and unable to survive. By the third day of the offensive, the Soviet strategy of deep battle was fully revealed. The Red Army did not waste time smashing their heads against the fortified cities of Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk. Instead, they simply flowed around them. The Soviet tank corps, moving with a speed that stunned the German high command, bypassed the strongpoints entirely, severing their supply lines and continuing deep into the rear. The breakwaters did not break the tide. They were submerged by it. The German divisions inside these cities, stripped of their mobility, were no longer fighting a battle. They were waiting for the end. In his headquarters, now vibrating with the distant rumble of catastrophe, Field Marshal Busch finally grasped the horror of his position. The 3rd Panzer Army in the north was being shredded. The 9th Army in the south was being heralded into a cauldron near Bobruisk. His center, the 4th Army, was in danger of being encircled in a pocket larger than Stalingrad. Desperate, Busch reached for the phone. He called the Wolf's Lair, pleading for the only thing that could save his men: permission to maneuver, permission to retreat to the Dnieper River line. The answer from Berlin was icy and detached. The Führer orders that the positions must be held. Hitler, staring at maps in East Prussia that were already hours out of date, refused to believe the scale of the breakthrough. He accused the commanders of cowardice. He insisted that the storm would pass if the soldiers simply stood their ground. Busch, a man who had built his career on obedience, paralyzed himself. He passed the order down the line, hold. With that single word, He sealed the fate of an entire army group. He was no longer commanding a fighting force. He was managing a cemetery. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground had descended into primal chaos. At Bobruisk, the Ninth Army was trapped against the river Berezina. Tens of thousands of men, horses, and vehicles were crammed into a shrinking pocket, relentlessly pounded by Soviet attack aircraft. The roads were clogged with burning wreckage. The Luftwaffe was non-existent. The discipline that had defined the Wehrmacht for 5 years began to disintegrate. Officers lost contact with their units. Regiments dissolved into terrified mobs. The invincible German soldier was reduced to a desperate fugitive running from a steel monster that seemed to be everywhere at once. As the pincers closed around Minsk, the capital of Belarusia and the nerve center of the German rear, the magnitude of the Soviet deception became absolute. They hadn't just deceived Busch about the location of the attack. They had deceived him about the nature of the war. Busch was fighting a static war of positions from 1917. The Soviets were fighting a war of movement and annihilation from the future. The trap was no longer closing, it was locked. And inside the pocket, the destruction of Army Group Center was shifting from a military operation into a massacre. The retreat, when it finally began, was not a military maneuver. It was a migration of the damned. By late June, the remnants of the German Fourth Army and Ninth Army were frantically trying to cross the Berezina River to reach the perceived safety of Minsk. But the bridges were few, the roads were narrow, and the Soviet trap had already snapped shut behind them. What followed was one of the most gruesome spectacles of the Second World War. The main highway leading west became a choked artery of panic. Thousands of trucks, horse-drawn wagons, tanks running on fumes, and desperate infantrymen were compressed into a single, exposed column stretching for miles. Then, the Black Death arrived. This was the name the Germans had given to the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, a heavily armored Soviet ground attack aircraft. With the Luftwaffe completely absent, the Soviet pilots did not just attack. They practiced target practice. They flew in lazy circles over the stalled columns, dropping bombs and firing rockets into the dense mass of men and machines. The road turned into a slaughterhouse. Burning vehicles blocked the path, trapping those behind them in a cage of fire. There was no room to maneuver, no air defense to shoot back, and nowhere to run except into the swamps where partisans were waiting. Field Marshal Busch, now removed from command and replaced by Walter Model in a desperate last-ditch effort, could only watch the reports of total annihilation filter in. The invincible Army Group Center had ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. It wasn't just losing a battle, it was being erased from the map. Entire divisions, the 78th Sturm Division, the 12th Infantry, the 6th Infantry, simply vanished. They didn't retreat, they didn't surrender. They dissolved under the relentless pressure of the Soviet meat grinder. The radio waves were filled with the screams of units begging for ammo, for fuel, for orders, until one by one they went silent. On July 3rd, Soviet tanks rolled into the streets of Minsk. The speed of the advance was so terrifying that they captured the city before the German rearguard could even finish packing their files. The scene inside the city was surreal. German military police were still directing traffic at intersections while T-34 seconds were already blasting through the city center. The encirclement was complete. Over 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in a cauldron east of the city. They were cut off from the outside world, starving, low on ammunition, and squeezed from all sides by an enemy that had no interest in letting them escape. The strategic consequences were catastrophic. A hole, 400 kilometers wide, had been torn in the German Eastern Front. It was a void that could not be filled. There were no reserves left. The road to Warsaw, and ultimately the road to Berlin, lay wide open. The Fortified Places strategy had failed not just tactically, but strategically. By trying to hold everything, the German High Command had lost everything. The German soldier, once the master of the Blitzkrieg, was now the victim of a hyper-accelerated version of his own invention. As the dust settled over the burning roads of Belarusia, the scale of the defeat became impossible to hide. Army Group Center had lost more men and equipment in 2 weeks than it had in the entire Battle of Stalingrad. But unlike Stalingrad, which was a slow, grinding death, this was a sudden, violent decapitation. The German general staff in Berlin stared at their maps in horror. The center of their line was gone. The map didn't lie anymore. It screamed the truth. the war was lost. The trap that Busch had walked into had not just caught an army, it had broken the back of the Third Reich. While the forests of Belorussia were still smoldering, a different kind of shockwave began to ripple across the world. The destruction of Army Group Center was so absolute, so sudden, that nobody believed it. In London and Washington, Allied intelligence officers looked at the Soviet claims with skepticism. They could not accept that 28 German divisions, the backbone of the Wehrmacht, had been erased in less than 2 weeks. Even in Berlin, the denial continued. The propaganda machine tried to paint the catastrophe as a planned elastic defense, hiding the horrifying truth from the German public. But Joseph Stalin had a plan to prove the reality of his trap to the world, and he would do it with a theater of humiliation that history would never forget. On July 17th, 1944, the streets of Moscow were cleared of traffic. The sidewalks were packed with silent, waiting crowds. Then, the sound began a low, shuffling rumble that grew into a deafening roar. It was the sound of 57,000 pairs of boots striking the pavement. The survivors of General Busch's impregnable center had arrived, but they were not marching as conquerors, they were marching as cattle. At the head of this endless column walked 19 German generals. These were the men who, just weeks ago, had studied their maps in comfortable headquarters, confident in their fortified places and their superior tactics. Now, stripped of their weapons and covered in the dust of defeat, they were paraded like trophies. Behind them stretched miles of bedraggled soldiers, the remnants of the 4th and 9th Armies. They were unshaven, emaciated, and staring blankly ahead, their arrogance crushed under the weight of the disaster they had survived. The symbolism was brutal and calculated. As the column shuffled through the Garden Ring Road, the Moscow crowds did not scream or throw stones. They watched in an eerie, heavy silence. It was a silence that spoke louder than artillery, a collective witness to the breaking of the German spirit. And then, in a final gesture of contempt, street sweeper trucks followed directly behind the prisoners, washing the pavement with water, symbolically scrubbing the fascist filth from the capital. For the German generals marching in that parade, this was the ultimate realization of the trap they had underestimated. They had believed in a war of lines and positions, but they had been defeated by a war of deception and psychology. The Maskirovka had not just hidden tanks in a forest, it had hidden the capability of the Soviet state to inflict total annihilation. The parade was filmed and broadcast to the world. In Berlin, families watched newsreels in horror, searching the faces of the prisoners for their sons and husbands. The illusion of the stabilized front was shattered forever. This was the moment the psychological backbone of the Wehrmacht finally snapped. The loss of 300,000 men in Belorussia was a physical blow, but the sight of their commanders being herded through Moscow was a mortal wound to their morale. The myth of German military superiority, which had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, died on the streets of Moscow that July afternoon. The trap was no longer a military maneuver on a map. It was a historical verdict. The road to Berlin was not just open, it was inevitable. While the streets of Moscow echoed with the footsteps of captured Germans, the situation at the front had evolved from a military disaster into a strategic apocalypse. The hole in the German line was no longer just a tactical breach, it was a vacuum that was sucking in the entire Wehrmacht. In Berlin, the denial finally broke. Hitler, who had refused to give Field Marshal Busch the reserves he needed when it mattered, now frantically looked for a savior. He turned to Field Marshal Walter Model, a man known throughout the army as the Führer's fireman. Model was a brilliant, ruthless tactician who specialized in salvaging impossible situations. But when he arrived at the headquarters of Army Group Center in early July, he found that there was no fire to put out. The house was already burned to the ground. Model did not waste time with maps of fortified places. He looked at the reality on the ground with a cold, professional eye. He saw that the 4th and 9th armies were effectively gone. The 3rd Panzer Army had been shattered. Between the advancing Soviet tank spearheads and the borders of the German Reich, there was nothing. Just empty space, scattered security battalions, and terrified refugees. For the first time in the war, the Red Army was not just reclaiming Soviet soil, they were knocking on the door of East Prussia. The war was coming home to Germany. To plug this gaping wound, the German High Command was forced to make a fatal choice. They began to strip divisions from other fronts. Units were pulled from Ukraine in the south, weakening the line there. More critically, reinforcements that were desperately needed in Normandy to to stop the American breakout were diverted to the east. This was the ultimate consequence of the trap. The Soviet deception had not only destroyed an army group, it had paralyzed German strategy across the entire continent. The Allies in France faced lighter resistance because the tanks that should have been fighting them were burning on flat cars, heading to Poland, arriving too late to save anyone. But even with Model's ruthless energy, the Soviet advance seemed unstoppable. This was not the plodding Russian steamroller of 1941. This was a modern, mechanized juggernaut. The Soviet logistics, powered by hundreds of thousands of American-made Studebaker trucks, allowed them to sustain an advance at speeds that German planners thought impossible. They were moving 50, sometimes 60 kilometers a day. They captured Vilnius, then Kaunas, then swept towards the Vistula River. The German soldiers retreating west were not just outfought, they were outrun. They would set up a defensive line in the morning, only to find by noon that the Soviet tanks were already 20 kilometers behind them. Inside the German ranks, a new and terrifying realization took hold. The Untermensch, the subhuman enemy, described by Nazi propaganda, had mastered the art of war better than the masters themselves. The Soviets were executing complex, combined arms operations with a finesse that the Wehrmacht could no longer match. They used air power, artillery, and armor in a seamless symphony of violence. Model tried to construct a new line along the Vistula, scraping together cooks, clerks, and wounded men to hold the riverbanks. He was trying to build a dam against a tsunami with sandbags. As July turned to August, the Soviet offensive finally began to run out of fuel, halting just across the river from Warsaw. But the damage was total. The geographical buffer that had protected Germany for 3 years was gone. Army Group Center, the shield of the Reich, had been reduced to a few understrength divisions and a name on a map. The trap that had sprung in June had swallowed 28 divisions and shifted the entire center of gravity of World War II. General Busch's failure to read the map had cost Germany the war in the East. Now, Field Marshal Model was left with the grim task of fighting for mere survival on the doorstep of the fatherland itself. The firemen had arrived, but the world was already burning. The shockwaves from the collapse of Army Group Center traveled faster than any train. They bypassed the ruined tracks of Belarusia and detonated directly inside the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's secret headquarters in East Prussia. For years, a quiet, desperate conspiracy had been brewing within the German officer corps, waiting for the right moment to strike. The annihilation of 28 divisions in the East was that moment. To men like Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and Major General Henning von Tresckow, who served as the Chief of Staff for the Second Army within Army Group Center itself, the disaster was the final proof. Hitler was no longer just a tyrant. He was the gravedigger of Germany. Tresckow, witnessing the slaughter of his own men in the swamps, sent a message to the conspirators in Berlin. The assassination must be attempted at any cost. Even if it fails, we must take action in Berlin. Not for the practical purpose, but to prove to the world and to history that the German resistance movement dared to take the decisive step. The trap that had swallowed the army had also swallowed their last hesitation. They realized that the Fortified Places strategy was not madness. It was a crime against their own soldiers. The military aristocracy, the very caste that had conquered Europe, decided that the only way to save the nation was to kill its leader. On July 20th, 1944, less than a month after the Soviet offensive began, Stauffenberg placed his briefcase under a heavy oak table in the Wolf's Lair. The explosion that followed was meant to decapitate the Nazi regime and end the war before the Red Army reached the borders. But fate and a thick table leg intervened. Hitler survived, shaken but alive, with his eardrums burst and his trousers shredded. The divine providence he claimed had saved him was actually the prelude to a new kind of terror. The coup failed, and the vengeance that followed was biblical in its fury. The disaster in the East was no longer blamed on Soviet strategy or superior logistics. It was blamed on treachery. Hitler, consumed by paranoia, turned on his own generals. The court of honor stripped hundreds of officers of their rank. Field marshals were forced to take cyanide capsules. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and hung with piano wire. The Wehrmacht, already bleeding to death on the battlefield, began to cannibalize its own brain. The strategic consequence of July 20th was the final destruction of the German General Staff as an independent institution. Before the bomb, generals obeyed out of duty or tradition. After the bomb, They obeyed out of naked terror. Commanders at the front stopped offering tactical advice. They stopped suggesting retreats. They stopped telling the truth. Every report sent to Berlin was sanitized, every defeat minimized, for fear of being labeled a defeatist and executed. The chain of command froze. In the critical months of late 1944, as the Soviet juggernaut paused to refuel and the Allies in the West broke out of Normandy, the German army was led by a man fighting ghosts in his own bunker. The flexibility, the initiative, the Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, that had made the German army the most effective fighting force in history, was dead. It was replaced by a rigid, paralyzed fear. The trap set by the Soviets had done more than kill soldiers. It had driven the German leadership insane. Now, the war would not end with a negotiated peace or a strategic withdrawal. It would end only when the last bunker burned. As the summer of 1944 faded into autumn, the German High Command was forced to confront a horror greater than the battlefield, the spreadsheet. The destruction of Army Group Center was not just a military defeat. It was a logistical apocalypse from which the Third Reich would never recover. In the span of 5 weeks, the Wehrmacht had lost over 400,000 men. But the trap had swallowed something else, something that German industry, already groaning under the weight of Allied bombing, could not replace: the hardware of a superpower. 2,000 tanks and assault guns, 57,000 motor vehicles, 6,000 artillery pieces. These were not just numbers on a ledger, they represented years of production, engineering, and resource accumulation. They were left rusting in the forests of Belarusia, abandoned in the mud of the Berezina, or paraded through Moscow. The sheer scale of the equipment loss created a mathematical abyss. For every tank rolling out of a German factory in the Ruhr, the Soviets and Americans were producing 10. But now, Germany didn't just need to match production. They needed to replace an entire army group's worth of inventory overnight. It was an equation that no amount of will, propaganda, or wonder weapons could solve. To fill the void, where 28 divisions used to be, the Nazi leadership turned to desperation. They created the Volksgrenadier divisions. The name sounded imposing, designed to evoke the spirit of the people, but the reality was a hollow shell. These new units were formed from the scraps of the barrel sailors without ships, airmen without planes, old men with stomach ulcers, and boys who had barely started shaving. They were given abbreviated training, equipped with second-rate weapons, and thrown into the line to stop the Red Army veterans who had just destroyed the best soldiers Germany had ever produced. The quality of the German army, the qualitative superiority that generals like Gehr von Schweppenberg and Manstein had relied on to offset their numerical disadvantage, evaporated. The veterans who knew how to strip a machine gun in the dark, who knew the sound of incoming artillery, who knew how to coordinate a counterattack, they were dead or marching to Siberia. The institutional memory of the Wehrmacht died in the trap of Bagration. The new army was fragile, brittle, and prone to panic. They were not fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting because the military police behind them were more terrifying than the Russians in front of them. This degradation of force fundamentally changed the strategic map. Without a mobile, experienced reserve, the German doctrine of elastic defense trading space for time and striking back became impossible. You cannot conduct a mobile defense with soldiers who cannot march and tanks that do not exist. The front line became a rigid, brittle crust. Once cracked, there was nothing behind it to stop the flood. The Soviets knew this. They had learned that the German tiger had lost its teeth. The psychological impact on the German command was total paralysis. They stopped planning for offensives and started planning for delays. Every briefing in Berlin became an exercise in delusion, moving imaginary divisions across maps to stop real Soviet tank corps. The trap had effectively ended the war in the East as a contest of strategy. It had become a simple, brutal exercise in grinding down what little remained. The genius of the German General Staff, once the envy of the world, had been reduced to an accounting firm for a bankruptcy that had already happened. The books were balanced in blood, and the debt was due. By October 1944, the war had crossed a psychological threshold that no German general had dared to contemplate since 1914. The enemy was no longer on a map in a foreign land. The enemy was standing on German soil. The Soviet Red Army crossed the borders of East Prussia, the spiritual home of the Prussian military aristocracy. For the first time, the master race was not fighting for Lebensraum, or living space. They were fighting for their own living rooms. And yet, even as Soviet shells began to fall on German villages, the leadership in Berlin retreated further into a fantasy world. This was the phase of the wonder weapons. In the bunkers of the Wolf's Lair, Hitler and his remaining loyalists moved imaginary armies and spoke of technological miracles that would reverse the tide. They placed their faith in the V-2 rockets, the jet-powered Mi-262 fighters, and the new heavy tanks. But the generals on the ground, men like Heinrici and Guderian, knew the bitter truth. A jet fighter cannot hold a trench line. A V-2 rocket cannot stop a Soviet tank corps. The trap that had sprung in Belarusia had created a deficit of manpower that no machine could fill. The miracle they needed wasn't technological, it was demographic, and Germany was biologically bankrupt. To hide this bankruptcy, the regime committed its final crime against its own people, the creation of the Volkssturm. On October 18th, a decree was signed, mobilizing every German male between the ages of 16 and 60. It was a propaganda masterstroke and a military tragedy. Grandfathers who had fought in the First World War were pulled from their retirement, given an armband and a captured Italian rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition, and told to stop the most battle-hardened army in the world. Schoolboys were handed Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and bicycles, ordered to ride towards the front to face the T-34 seconds. The professional soldiers looked at these reinforcements with a mixture of pity and horror. They knew that the Volkssturm was not an army. It was a human speed bump. Sending these civilians into the meat grinder was not warfare, it was a national suicide pact. In East Prussia, at the village of Nemmersdorf, the reality of what happened when a militia met a mechanized army became clear. The Soviet vengeance was unleashed on the civilian population. The reports that filtered back to the rest of Germany were so terrifying that they had the opposite effect of what Goebbels intended. Instead of inspiring a heroic defense, they inspired a panic that clogged the roads west, further paralyzing the movement of the few real combat units left. As the winter of 1944 set in, a strange, suffocating silence fell over the Vistula front. The Soviets had stopped to resupply, building up their strength for the final leap to Berlin. The German generals used this time not to plan victory, but to plan the impossible logistics of survival. They were scavenging for fuel, counting artillery shells by the single digits, and writing letters home that they knew might never be delivered. The delusion of the final victory was screamed from the radios, but in the trenches, the silence spoke louder. Every soldier knew that the dam was cracking. The trap that had opened in June had not finished its work. It was simply taking a breath before the final, fatal lunge at the heart of the Reich. In April 1945, 10 months after Field Marshal Busch stared at his map in Minsk, the final act of the tragedy played out in the ruined streets of Berlin. The Soviet tanks that were now blasting the Reichstag apart were the same T-34 seconds that had emerged from the Pripet Marshes. The artillery shells raining down on the Führer bunker were fired by the same batteries that had opened the Symphony of Destruction on June 22nd. The trap that was set in the forests of Belarusia had not just captured an army group, it had captured history itself. The road from Minsk to Berlin was paved with the wreckage of German pride, a straight line drawn in fire and blood. When we analyze why Army Group Center was annihilated, it is easy to blame Hitler's rigid orders or the lack of reserves. But the true cause of the disaster was something far deeper. General Busch walked into the trap not because he was incompetent, but because he was arrogant. He, like the entire German military establishment, suffered from a fatal blindness. They believed that their enemy was racially inferior, incapable of complex deception, and unable to master the art of modern war. They looked at a swamp and saw a wall, because they could not imagine that subhumans could build bridges where Aryan engineers could not. This underestimation was the ultimate trap. The Maskirovka worked because the Germans wanted to believe it. They wanted to believe the Soviets were exhausted. They wanted to believe the attack would come in the south. They wanted to believe that they were still the masters of the battlefield. The Soviet High Command used this arrogance as a weapon. They didn't just hide their tanks, they hid their competence. They let the Germans feel safe until the moment the knife was already at their throat. The destruction of Army Group Center teaches us a brutal lesson about the nature of conflict. Victory does not go to the side with the most famous generals or the most disciplined parades. It goes to the side that sees reality clearly. The Wehrmacht spent 1,944 fighting the war. They wanted to fight a war of tactical duels and local counterattacks. The Red Army fought the war as it actually was a war of industrial systems, strategic deception, and ruthless logistics. When those two realities collided, the illusion shattered. In the end, the German general did not just lose a battle, he lost his world. The fortified places became mass graves, the invincible army became a column of prisoners, and the map, which Busch had trusted so implicitly, became a historical indictment of a regime that chose to die rather than admit it was wrong. The trap of June 1944 was the moment the Second World War was truly decided. It was the moment the German sword was broken, not by superior force alone, but by a superior understanding of the truth. The silence that followed the fall of Berlin was the same silence that had preceded the attack in the forests of Belarusia, heavy, absolute, and final. But this time, there was no one left to interpret it. The lesson had been delivered. The age of German military dominance was over, buried in the swamps where they refused to look.